When I die, hallelujah, by and by, I will fly away.
That is Dennis Quaid singing I'll Fly Away, but you may just know him as an actor. Coming up on this special edition of Studio 5.
Get into these arms, you little punk.
We're talking to Quaid about his movie roles. One thing that I saw that I didn't recall or remember is you got to play with Tupac.
Yeah.
And his favorite role to date, playing America's 40th president in the biopic Reagan. What does this role mean to you?
This role, it's become my favorite role I've ever had, actually.
Wow.
I have a different way of judging my movies that I do because I judge them by the experience that I had while I was making them, you know.
He's talking about Reagan's love and faith story.
Ronnie, remember when we met? You told me that you wanted to make a difference in this world. You know what you have to do.
All of this is coming up one-on-one with Dennis Quaid.
Now he can do a thing or two.
Dennis Quaid has played numerous roles, including in The Big Easy, Dragonheart, and The Parent Trap. It's a career that spans decades, and at 70 years old, he isn't planning to slow down anytime soon. So what keeps you going, Dennis Quaid? You are not eyeing retirement. You started a production company now. What's keeping you going?
I love doing what I do now more than I did when I started, for sure. You know, it's just grown. It's great you're an actor. You know, athletes, God bless them, man. You know, you as an athlete, you spend your whole life in a locker room playing your sport and stuff, and then one day they just take your ball away. You know, because you can't compete with an actor. You know, you just get older and the parts get older. That's all. And I'm doing. I'm not trying to get anywhere with it. I'm just doing stuff that I love and that interests me. And I mean, you can't ask for better than that.
Where did the acting bug come for you?
Probably from our dad. He was a frustrated actor, turned us on to different actors in movies. And, you know, as a kid, I would go to the movies and I'd come out feeling like I was Steve McQueen, you know, or James Bond, or, you know, Jimmy Stewart. And that's probably where it came from. And then just got to high school and I wanted to be a veterinarian, but I kind of went by the side.
I've heard you recently say that your brother is one of your favorite actors. Any hope that you'll pull him out of retirement or to get a role?
I would love to see him come out and do Vacation 4. I'd love to see the return of Cousin Eddie. I think all of America would too.
Just can't believe you're actually standing here in my living room, Eddie. Never thought the day would come.
Yeah, I'm excited about it too.
You haven't been able to talk him into it.
No.
One thing that I saw that I didn't recall or remember is you got to play with Tupac. You had a role with him?
Yeah.
What do you remember about that?
It's called Gang Related. It was a small movie. I don't know if many people saw it, actually. Jim Belushi and Tupac and myself. And, you know, that was early 90s.
Yeah.
I think it was, right?
Yeah.
And it was about 6 to 8 months before he was shot and killed. And he was, 24? Yeah, and sure. He was, I mean, putting the two of us together was, you know, not like you wouldn't just think of it right off the bat. No. I barely knew really who he was. I knew who he was. But I really was not into, you know, hip hop culture and everything. For me, it just hit. And here comes Tupac, and the two of us just like really clicked, you know. And that was over Chinese food. He loved Chinese food, and I did too. So we'd be downtown, you know, on the set, and we'd order Chinese food and have in the trailer, and we just talked for, you know, every day. Wow. Spent a couple hours just talking, and you know, about his mother, about his career, about acting. He had a real thirst to learn, and he had a real humbleness to him that made that ability to listen. And me, I was riveted by the guy. He taught me a lot, and just confirmed a lot of things in life. He was such a poet, and it really hit me when he got shot.
I can imagine.
And what could have been, really what could have been. I think he could have been a great unifier.
Now, what do we have here? Where were you last Friday night?
Look, Joe, this is where you killed him.
Whatever evidence there is, it's got to go through us.
What, are you joking me?
Dennis Quaid has a slew of new projects coming soon. He gives me a preview of what's to come. So what's the next project for you? What's happening after this?
Gosh, I got a bunch of movies coming out.
That you already done?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. One called The Substance with Demi Moore, Margaret Qualley. And another one called Sovereign, which is about sovereign people, and this is another true story. Sovereign is. And I just played a serial killer for, what do you do after Reagan? You play a serial killer, a real one, the happy face killer. Which I'm not really drawn to playing serial killers or whatever, but this is a unique story because it's the story of a father and daughter. He was this guy, he killed 8 women over a period of 5 years. He was a trucker, but he was a doting father, and the relationship that he had with his daughter is how do you put all that, reconcile that, with your dad and this monster. And it's very much about their relationship now. And she's gone out to help other families who were children of, or families of these sick people that do these things, because it affects everybody. Yeah, victims. And but it's interesting in that way. A story worth telling. I didn't go and meet him because I didn't want to give him any kind of the credit, but still, that's my job is to portray human nature, at our best and our worst.
Still to come, Dennis Quaid is talking about his role playing America's 40th president, Ronald Reagan. What does this role mean to you?
It's become my favorite role I've ever had, actually. Reagan was a hero of mine. I voted for him twice, and he was like everybody's dad.
Welcome back to this Studio 5 one-on-one conversation with Dennis Quaid. His latest film is the role of our 40th president in the biopic Reagan. It's a role he says is his favorite.
I will be frank with you that as a citizen, I would not like to see any political party outlawed on the basis of its ideology, because I still believe, Mr. Chairman, that democracy can handle it.
What does this role mean to you? You've been busy, but now you get to play Reagan. What does this role mean to you?
This role, it's become my favorite role I've ever had, actually.
Wow.
Before this, it was The Right Stuff. I have a different way of judging my movies that I do, because I judge them by the experience that I had while I was making them, And Reagan was a hero of mine. I voted for him twice, and he was like everybody's dad, for better or worse. It was kind of, back then, a lot of people called him a warmonger, and was an actor, Bedtime for Bonzo, and that he was a lightweight, but he was a real heavyweight, and he won the Cold War. It really meant a lot to me in my life, for all of us of that generation, and for the generations today. And playing him was the challenge of my life.
I'm running for governor, and I would like your vote.
I've forgotten your name.
Do his initials help, RR?
What was the hardest part?
The biggest challenge of playing Reagan was getting down to him as a person, you know, not the hero that he was to me and so many people. And that's kind of warts and all, you know, because that's who we are.
Yeah.
But I played a lot of real people in my life. You know, I played Gordo Cooper in The Right Stuff. I played Doc Holliday. I played Jerry Lee Lewis.
Right.
I feel a responsibility to play them from their point of view, because that's how we live our lives.
Yeah.
And so there was a place in Reagan, in talking to people who really knew him and were close to him, that was very private, that was impenetrable. This is the great communicator we're talking about. And what was that all about? That's what makes people tick, down at their core. And that was where I wanted to get to. Like I said, I didn't want to do an impersonation, and fear went up my spine, because Reagan was like Muhammad Ali. Everybody knows him, you know. But I did get to that place.
Yeah.
And it was a place where I think was looking the eye of the storm for him, where he could really contemplate and have privacy, in a sense.
What do you think was the driving force within him to achieve such greatness? What was the push?
His principles. He lived and governed by principles. He was a Democrat, a Franklin Roosevelt Democrat, way up until like 1964, and he. In that, you know, our movie too is really about how we won the Cold War and fighting communism, which is a very real thing. People of my generation, we would have these drills out of the blue in school where, you know, we'd have to get under our desk because, you know, what would happen in a nuclear attack? We all would be incinerated, but at least we'd be under our desk, I guess. It was a very frightening time, and nuclear war almost happened so many times. And it was, you know, going to happen in our lifetime. And Reagan, by principles, is the way that he wanted. And that meant sometimes as a leader making unpopular decisions, but the right decisions.
Did your paths ever cross?
No, I saw him in I was playing golf in LA one time, and I saw him in the other fairway. This is after he was president, you know, and he was well into his 80s, you know, maybe in 90, and he would really hit the ball. He was always in good shape.
So you saw him, and you remember that for sure.
Oh yeah, it's etched in my memory. Like I said, he was my favorite president. Yeah, he really was. And to everybody that he wasn't their favorite president, he was everybody's dad when he was president, at least to the baby boom generation, you know, and that meant for better or worse, you're either rebelling against your dad or you idolize your dad.
Absolutely.
You know, and sometimes both.
Yeah. Knowing what you know now, having played the role, how would you compare the Reagan family to the Quaid family?
Come to find out we were similar in many ways. I didn't see myself as Reagan. I didn't think I looked like him and, you know, sounded like him, anything like that. And then but we both have sunny dispositions, and I think down at the bottom of things. And he was an actor, and that was kind of a way in for me too, because being an actor, I realized that Reagan in his acting career never got to where he wanted to get to. He was relegated to B movies by Jack Warner, the studios. It was like John Wayne already filled that part, you know? Yeah. And then, you know, his career was really kind of on the way down when he and Jane Wyman got married. And she won an Academy Award, you know, as his career is going down. I think he felt like Mr. Mom, and he was, you know, it had to be frustrating for him. And, but also, that's what kind of, I think, compelled him to seek out being vice president and then president of the Screen Actors Guild, because that wasn't a job that you sought out if you were an actor.
Right.
You know, it was something that you did if your career was starting to wane, or that turned out to be really him finding God's purpose for him on this earth, which was his entry into politics.
Tell me about finding the voice, because Reagan had such a distinctive voice, and I can imagine that had to have been weighing on your mind.
Yeah, well, that and the way he walked, and you know, all the physicalities of him that everybody knows. And I was lucky because they got the part, they offered me the part in 2018. We didn't start shooting until COVID in 2020. Great time to make a movie. And it was, I basically talked like that for a year.
Really?
to the my family's, you know, they had to put up with it, I guess. But, you know, it was, so I watched a lot of YouTube. That's really great, great research source. But Reagan also, you know, in earlier life, he had you know, his voice was very much higher. It was way up here, you know, and it wasn't until about the time that he was president that, you know, he comes down to where you slow down and you talk slower.
I call upon the scientific community, those who gave us nuclear weapons, to turn their great talents now to the cause of mankind and world peace.
The film Reagan is available right now wherever you watch your streaming material. Still to come, Dennis Quaid talks about Reagan's faith and love story. This is also a love story.
Yes, it is. At the core of our movie is the love story between he and Nancy.
Welcome back to our Studio 5 one-on-one conversation with Dennis Quaid. He portrays the role of President Ronald Reagan and shares a look at Reagan's faith walk and love story.
Dutch, there's a purpose for your life.
You can run from a bully for so long, but after a while, you're going to have to stand up to it.
You, in this story, explore more of his faith than people are probably used to seeing.
Well, it's because it was such a huge part of his life. It was an everyday part of his life, you know, starting from as a young boy. And, you know, he even made the decision on his own to be baptized at that time. And, you know, something that really was, he walked with every day. His mother was his rock. Yeah. That's another way that we're very similar. And he had an alcoholic father, which is kind of similar to, you know, and, you know, that does something to a person, and you need a rock. And he found that early on. And certainly got out to Hollywood, and, you know, that can lead you all kinds of ways.
Indeed.
Yeah, it does. And, you know, we live in the world, and we're human. That's, you know, God knows that. We're going to go out and see what the world holds for us, you know. That means jumping over fences sometimes, I think, you know, until you realize, hey, I'm not going to jump over the fence anymore. And, you know, he had that too. And, you know, he was a very human person. He was the first divorced president that we had, by the way. And he, you know, he changed over the years. But faith was certainly during his presidency is something he really relied on. They tried to assassinate him
early on,
Hinckley, you know, 3 months into his presidency. And he himself said that, you know, my life is no longer my own. There's a lot to do, and from here on out, I'm living it for the man upstairs.
This is also a love story.
Yes, it is.
Hello, I'm Nancy Davis.
Hello, Nancy Davis. I'm Ron Reagan.
At the core of our of our movie is the love story between he and Nancy, which was very real and very rare. Actually, how close that they were. He wrote her love letters like every day, a little note or whatever, you know, even when he was in the hospital after the assassination attempt, actually. And I don't think there would have been a President Reagan if it wasn't for Nancy. Wow. Not that she was the puppet master like they used to portray, but just that's what, you know, a great relationship that, you know, that also God as president, it's a strength that that both man and woman can draw on and for greater things.
Ronnie, remember when we met? You told me that you wanted to make a difference in this world. You know what you have to do.
One of my favorite scenes is when Reagan is being asked to stop riding his horse. I just can imagine the sensitive nature of that for Nancy to know that this is coming in for, we're really realizing we're at the end here. What was a favorite scene for you in the film?
In the film? Well, we're talking about when Reagan was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, which I thought was one of the bravest decisions that he made, both he and Nancy, the way they handled that. When he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, he sat down and wrote a letter to the American people to let them know, and you know, to help Nancy when the time came about it. He knew he'd be losing a lot of his faculties as time went by. And back then, it seems like kind of an easy thing then because of social media and everything that we have. Everybody tells everybody everything. That was a very sensitive subject back then. And, you know, that took courage to do that and brought a light to Alzheimer's. And I would like for this movie to again shine a light on that, because it's an easier cure than cancer, I believe. And I think we're getting there. And my generation, the baby boom generation, there's more of us than anybody else. And, you know, it's I think in our generation, it can be solved, because it's devastating not only to the person, but to the families. And I think it was special the way he handled that.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Here's a fun fact. Kathy Lee Gifford is also a part of this biopic, providing music for the film's soundtrack. Welcome back to Studio 5. Music helps us to bring you this show each and every week, and this week's soundtrack comes from Dennis Quaid. That's right, the actor is also a recording artist. Take a listen and you'll hear why his take on Amazing Grace is what's playing in my ear this week.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Who I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see.
We've got just a few moments left in the show. Let's give that to Dennis Quaid. He's got our final word. Any thoughts on would a Reagan presidency work during this time period?
Oh, for sure. So many circumstances are the same, and I think he could run today on, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And we have, you know, oil is definitely big part of this, and the economy. We had 20% interest rates back then. I know I bought a house during that time.
I'm sorry.
And we had hostages in Iran. We have hostages in the Gaza Strip that nobody's talking about.
Right.
Why is that? And there was this sense back then that we were a nation in decline. And Reagan came along and said, no, we're not. We're going this way, right here. Mm-hmm. And America came roaring back.
That's a great final word for this edition of Studio 5. Until next time, make time to uplift someone around you, and then please come on back. See where Studio 5 takes you next week. Bye-bye. Thank you so much for watching.